In Dutch history, women are everywhere. From Kenau, during the siege of Haarlem, to Anna Visser, to Anna Maria van Schurman. But their stories aren't exactly talked about a whole lot. So it's time that people meet some more extraordinary women of their time. Meet Anna Maria van Schurman. She was born on the 5th of November 1607 in Cologne, Germany, as the daughter of Frederik van Schurman and Eva von Harf de Drijboer. And she comes from a family that has their roots in Antwerp. However, her grandparents flee Antwerp via Frankfurt am Main. Her family reached Cologne in 1593 and then moved to the Dutch city of Utrecht in 1615. And Anna Maria van Schurman stayed in Utrecht for most of her life, around 40 years. And Utrecht is also the city where she became the very first female student in the Netherlands, and some say the first female student of Europe. Whether you can really call her a student is questionable, because women weren't allowed to officially enroll as a student nor take any exams. So officially, she might not have been the very first, but she was there. And also in the end, that's not the most interesting thing about all of this, because she pushed boundaries and people helped her with pushing those boundaries as they saw how smart she was. And she ended up studying at the University of Utrecht in 1636. But she wasn't just a student, she was extremely knowledgeable. She was a scholar, she was a poet, she was an artist, she was a linguist. She spoke tons of languages, including Aramaic, Hebrew, Dutch, Arabic, Greek. And she was also well versed in philosophy and theology. But this didn't just happen overnight, obviously. How was it possible that Anna Maria van Schurman was able to follow classes at the University of Utrecht? And how did she get the opportunity to become a master of so many subjects as a woman during that time? And to get to the bottom of that, we need to go back to her younger life. Like I said, Anna Maria van Schurman, she was born in Cologne in 1607. She was very fortunate as she was the daughter of a noble and rich family. That gave her a lot of privilege that other women of that time didn't possess. And she took advantage of it and the connections her family had. She learned how to read the Bible at the age of 3. And they reached the Netherlands in 1613 and started living in Utrecht in 1615. Anna Maria was homeschooled, first by loads of teachers and later on by her dad. And they quickly realized that she was very smart for her age. Now, in the 17th century, it was pretty common for boys and girls to go to school, but it was also uncommon in some parts. But that didn't mean it was an actual school. There was no school building. Usually lessons were given at a teacher's shed or barn or something like that. The young students would learn to read and write and sometimes calculate, but they had to pay for each lesson, and calculating was the most expensive and also the subject that wasn't taught at most village schools. And obviously not everyone could afford to go to these schools, let alone be homeschooled by incredible teachers. And later on, her highly educated father, who also taught her on the subjects of Latin, Greek, geography, history, maths and theology. But it didn't happen entirely according to the plan of her parents. Her dad, Frederik, actually thought that the classical languages were too difficult for her in the beginning. But then one day he found out that wasn't the case. In fact, it was her elder brothers that were falling behind in that regard. Her dad tested her older brothers about the Latin lessons he was giving them. They didn't know the answer, Anna Maria did. So Anna Maria had better access to information and more wealth than, let's say, 99% of Dutch kids at that time. So she was homeschooled, she learned Latin, which was extraordinary for a woman around that time and at that age. Anna Maria ended up being very aware of the fact that it was extraordinary that she was able to get so much access to information and to teachers. And she was also very grateful for that. She was also writing poetry at an incredibly young age and therefore already made important and high society acquaintances when she was very young. Around 1620, when she was only 13, she was in contact with Anna Visser, who was a very well-known writer, poet, translator and artist in the Netherlands, and also with Jacob Cats, who was an important Dutch politician and poet, at the age of 13. Both these people were at the top of the intellectual and artistic society in the Netherlands at that time. They were very impressed by her knowledge and artistic talents, and eventually this spread even further to people like Constantijn Huygens, who was not only a poet and composer, but also the secretary to 2 princes of Orange, and the father of Christian Huygens, the inventor of the pendulum clock, amongst others. So I think you know by now that she was pretty loved by the people at the very top of society. And she mostly corresponded and wrote poetry in Latin. Now, Anna Maria eventually moved from Utrecht to Franeker when she was 14 as a brother, Johan Godschalk, went to go and study at the University of Franeker in 1623, her father also wanted to take some classes at the university and at the faculty. Unfortunately, he passed away pretty soon. He became sick before the new academic year had begun, and he passed away shortly after Anna Maria, her 15th birthday on the 15th of November 1623. And at his deathbed, her father had Anna Maria promise him that she would never get married because that was the only way her massive talent wouldn't get lost, as married mothers obviously were tasked with everything besides gaining knowledge on different subjects besides their children. And since I'm making this video about Anna Maria, I think you understand that Anna Maria did pretty well. And she kept her word that she gave to her father. She never married. She was famed all throughout Europe and corresponded with the most important scientists of her time. She was highly educated on languages, art, theology, philosophy, and science. However, after her father dies, Anna is in despair and stops her studies of all the subjects. She's incredibly sad that he is not there anymore. She doesn't really know what to do. And that is when she got a dream. And not just any dream. No, it was a dream that saved her, according to Anna Maria. Lady Philosophy showed up in her dream and told her that she shouldn't wallow in her sadness, but she has to be guided by reason. And it worked. She starts studying again, even more than before. The family moved back to Utrecht in 1626 and ended up buying a house there in 1629. And Anna Maria van Schurman ended up living in Utrecht for around 40 years. Johan, her brother, who was studying at Franeker, he was also taking care of the theological and literary formation of his sister after their father died. And through him, she got more and more intellectual contacts in high society, including the following professors: Caspar Berlioz, Daniel Heinsius, Gisbertus Fuchsius, and André Rivet. Now, how did she become a student? What was she more knowledgeable about? Who admired her? Who were her contacts? Later in life, she studied modern languages, so she already knew Latin and German and Dutch and stuff, but she started learning more, not just modern languages, but also different languages like Aramaic, Chaldean, Hebrew, and Syriac. And people say that her goal was to read the text of the Bible in their original languages. She also learned and mastered how to draw, sculpt, do calligraphy, and create cutting art, amongst others. In 1636, she was the first female student in the Netherlands to be admitted to the University of Utrecht. Not officially though, as women weren't allowed to actually register as a student nor take any exams until the late 19th century. And because women weren't allowed to study at a university at that time, she attended lectures from a small room behind a curtain. The male students couldn't see her like that because, imagine that, seeing the face of a woman when you're supposed to be studying is very distracting. But if you're, just my 2 cents, if you're getting distracted by the face of a woman who is studying, then perhaps you shouldn't be in the room if you do not actually want to study. People would have hated me in the 17th century. But how is it possible that she was able to even take these lectures when it was normally not even possible? Anna Maria had to thank professor, theologian, and preacher Gisbertus Fuchsius for that. He lived near Anna Maria in Utrecht and actually invited her to speak at the newly created university to praise it in 1636. And she did, in Latin. But she didn't just praise this newly established university, no. She actually advocated for the admission of women to academia, amongst other things. And in the speech she wrote that a university like this one is amazing and important for Utrecht, but that this sanctuary remains closed for women. It was also published in many international papers, which made Anna Maria famous across the entire European continent. And because of that, she was also able to correspond with scholars from all over Europe and was able to participate in academic life. She was often at Gisbertus Fuchsius' place, as she considered him one of her most important teachers, and he basically lived around the corner. Besides theology, he also taught the Eastern languages, and he used them as a tool to understand the Bible better. And Anna Maria often borrowed his books. She wrote a Latin treatise about women and that they are suitable for science and learning. She writes it in a writing style that is very common at the university, and she also makes references to famous scholars like Erasmus, Plato, amongst others. And this was the reason that Professor Fuchsius allowed her to follow lessons at the University of Utrecht and to also follow classes in literature and medicine. And it was eventually turned into a book that turned Anna Maria van Schurman basically into a celebrity across the entire continent, as the books were spread, read and loved all over Europe and also translated to French and English. Anna Maria was also part of the Republiek der Letteren. This was basically a European network with all sorts of academics that crossed basically political and religious borders. And it was all about your knowledge. And the scholars were all corresponding with each other through letters in which they keep each other up to date of the latest scientific news. She also got visitors in Utrecht pretty often, including the Swedish Queen Christina. She brought a visit to Anna Maria when she was traveling to Rome. And in Rome, a portrait of Anna Maria was hung at the Accademia dei Lincei. She also got to know a Frenchman, René Descartes, butchering that, who was the opposite of her scholar friend, Fuchsius, who was basically her teacher, remember? René was very impressed by Anna Maria until he realized that she was too radical in a religious way for him. And the feeling was mutual because he was not religious enough for Anna Maria to continue their friendship and correspond with him. He had a philosophy that not many people of the time appreciated. He openly doubted whether there was a God and that the body and soul could be disconnected in a sense. He stated that the sun was the center of it all and not Earth. His ideas basically opened up a new idea of the world, one without a creator and without a purpose. And in a very religious society, that idea and thought process is not very common. So what is the importance of Anna Maria van Schurman for Dutch women and Dutch women going to university? I don't think many people in the Netherlands know much about her at all, but also don't know how many boundaries she broke and crossed. She broke through endless social conventions of her time, and she surprised people with her knowledge, mostly because people tended to underestimate women, still do. But she did it anyway, and she continued learning and breaking boundaries. She corresponded with high society and well-studied men and women all over Europe, and she pleaded for scientific practice by women, which led to great international fame for Anna Maria. She was a popular figure in literary circles and even had tons of 17th century pieces, art pieces, and stuff dedicated to her. And during her time, people had several nicknames for her, including Minerva Batava, or the Dutch Minerva, which is of course a compliment. But while she had some good nicknames, she was also named things like Monstrum Naturae, a monster of nature. She was deemed an anomaly because she was a woman, and she was often the subject of jokes, and ambiguous jokes were also very common, even by those that she would have called her friends. She battled stereotypes in this sense and kept on going anyway. She paved the way for women to study at the University of Utrecht and in other places in the Netherlands, while it still took centuries after her death for this to become common and official. I can't help but think how normal it is for us nowadays, as women in the Netherlands, to just go to school. We don't have to battle to be able to learn. We've come a long way, obviously. We're not there yet, but we've come a long way. And I think that Anna Maria would be proud of all the women that have pursued degrees and that keep on learning in one way or another. I think she is and has been more important to the education of women than we acknowledge. And yes, obviously, she was rich, which was a big reason as to why she was able to do this, because she didn't have to work. She didn't have to get married in order to, have a roof over her head. She had her family's money. But while she was privileged, she was also oppressed because she was a woman. But Anna Maria demanded space for women in science. She wrote and discussed it endlessly. And for instance, there were some men who stated that women would be too dumb for science. She obviously didn't agree, but Anna Maria smartly used both sides and statements to her advantage. She wrote, "For anyone who has a less fortunate nature or talents, the tools with which one can combat those shortcomings are very suitable, and the practice of science is such an aid, or such a tool." In her later life, Anna Maria van Schurman became a bit more radical when it came to her faith. She was always religious, as almost anyone during that time. And in most of her earlier poems, Anna Maria talked about subjects like education for women. However, this changed around the 1660s due to her being uncomfortable with the direction of the Dutch Calvinist Church, and she became more conservative and more comfortable with religious groups that went for a, let's say, more intimate experience. She came in contact with preacher Jean de Labadie in the 1660s, and when he held services in Middelburg, which is the capital of Zeeland, Anna Maria often traveled there with her friends to listen to it. Her poems ended up being more and more about faith in a very devout way, and she was often criticizing fellow believers. She ended up breaking with the Dutch Reformed Church, so she left the church and decided to join the cult, which is, it is what we would call a cult nowadays, the cult of Jean de Labadie. And he was a charismatic preacher that advocated for a strict and pure faith in Jesus Christ, and Anna Maria was a fan of that. Now, Anna Maria was one of the first members to join Jean de Labadie in the area. The Church of Utrecht tried to persuade Anna Maria to return to their church. Didn't work. Her decision was also heavily criticized by her scholar friends, but Anna Maria didn't care. She eventually joined the Labadist community, which was, Jean de Labadie, Labadist, and went to live with them in Germany in Westphalen, and there a former friend of hers, Elizabeth of Paltz, offered the group housing, and later on they moved to Altona near Hamburg, and in 1675 they moved to the Frisian village of Wiewoord. In the last years of her life, Anna Maria didn't have to do anything in the house of the Labadist community because she was old, and she was mostly sitting in a sort of wheelchair amongst her fellow Labadists. She also was still interested in art and science, and she had a high position in the Labadist community. And Anna Maria van Schurman passed away in Wiewoord in May 1678 at the age of 70, and she's also buried in Wiewoord. What was also very interesting about the Labadist community is that it was mostly filled with people that were found in the upper classes of society from all over Europe. Italians, the French, Dutch, Danish, Polish, Germans, etc. The group wanted to go back to the origins of the Bible, and in their ideas this meant that simplicity was key. That meant that they would pass any possessions they have to the entire group. So everything that Anna Maria owned, including the possessions, including the house in Utrecht, those kind of things, all went to the community. The Labadists didn't make it out of the 18th century. The movement had died out in the Netherlands by the 1730s. And after that, Anna Maria van Schurman was still famous for her art, but not for her knowledge. In the 18th and 19th century, the attention had shifted to praising her virtuous qualities and her morality and modesty. That changed slowly when a monograph was made about Anna Maria by Gilles Dionysius Jacobus Schotel, who was a Dutch preacher, historian, writer, amongst others. And he told everyone about her proficiency and knowledge of the arts, literature, linguistics, and science. Only in the first half of the 20th century, people became more aware about her knowledge and her plea for the woman's right to study.